This is Israel. Now let's jump to a very interesting spot on the map, right here. Around you can see farmland, small communities, and the kind of sandy landscape you see all over Israel. But in this exact area, Israel's actually carrying out a massive construction project. Let's take a closer look at what's going on. First come hundreds of explosions. Israel's using tons of explosives here. The crew moves in to level the ground and install a massive metal fence. In some sections, metal gives way to concrete, with walls rising about 20 to 30 feet high. So what is this, some ultra-sensitive military site they decided to fortify? Not at all. Israel's doing something much bigger here. In fact, there are dozens of sites like this all along the eastern border with Jordan, and construction's underway at all of them. Why? Because many of these sections will soon be linked together into one enormous barrier stretching about 310 miles and costing $1.7 billion. So why does Israel need all this in the first place? And why do they have to blast the land before they can build? Let's find out. So what could possibly make Israel build a 310-mile wall costing $1.7 billion? The answer's pretty simple: the threat from the east. October 18, 2024. On that day, two armed men crossed the border from Jordan and somehow made it all the way to the Dead Sea area. Definitely not tourists. Then came the shooting. Israeli forces responded quickly and killed both attackers, but there were consequences. 2 Israelis were wounded, and this is not some one-off incident. In 2023, Israel's Internal Security Service had already raised the alarm after 2 men crossed the border and managed to move around inside the country before they were found in the Jordan Valley. When they were caught, one of them was carrying an assault rifle. What would have happened if they'd not been stopped in time? No one really knows. Now, someone might say, what if people cross Israel's eastern border illegally without weapons? Does that really make them dangerous? Well, maybe not, but only at first glance. In real life, weapons often come in through the very same route. Someone may be unarmed today and armed by tomorrow. Take 2024, for example, at a checkpoint near Eilat. What looked like a routine inspection of a vehicle arriving from Jordan turned into something very different. Instead of suitcases and souvenirs, officers found 74 Glock pistols and 61 magazines. All of it was being smuggled illegally. Later, the same pattern showed up again, only on a bigger scale. In 2025, police stopped several vehicles. They contained 34 pistols, 2 Kalashnikov rifles, and 2 M16 rifles. The weapons were carefully concealed, which suggested planning and coordination. And once again, the shipment had come from Jordan. According to Israeli security assessments, this is not random. These shipments move through organized smuggling networks. Someone has studied people, routes, and weak points along the border closely. Weapons gradually make their way into Israel and into the West Bank, where they can end up in the hands of people with very different intentions. But that's not the only concern. Along with weapons, other things are entering the country that could be harmful in the long run. That includes drugs. They're moved along the same covert routes, often practically under the noses of border forces. And the scale is honestly alarming. In one case in the Jordan Valley, authorities found about 330 pounds of drugs hidden right near the border, almost ready to be moved farther in. That's hard to even wrap your head around. According to security officials, attempts like this happen regularly. The numbers change, the routes shift, but the basic pattern stays the same. People keep trying to use the border like an open corridor. And sometimes, frankly, it works. And that raises an obvious question. Why doesn't Israel simply pressure Jordan if that's where all of this is coming through? It really does sound like that's the most obvious solution. But once you look a little closer, the reality becomes far less simple. In many cases, Jordan's more of a transit point than the actual source. It's a corridor the flow moves through, not where it begins. Look at a map and a lot of it starts to make sense. Jordan's border is long, complicated, and in some areas relatively exposed. Keeping it under total control is close to impossible, and right next door is Syria, a country where large-scale drug production has continued even after the change in power. According to multiple security services, significant quantities of narcotics are moving out of Syria. The story becomes even more complicated when it comes to weapons and people. That's where Iran comes in. And yes, the obvious question is, how? It's nearly 620 miles away, but Iran has its own methods. It operates through a network of allied groups, what analysts usually call proxies. These groups are active in Syria, Lebanon, and other parts of the region. That's where resources are gathered, weapons, manpower, and logistics. It's also where people are trained, assigned, and sometimes effectively kept in reserve. From there, the movement begins gradually, through Jordan and closer to Israel's border. So yes, Israel sees a real need to secure its border with Jordan against all of these flows. And in 2025-2026, it decided to go big, to build a large-scale defensive barrier. So what exactly is it? The barrier is expected to stretch for roughly 310 miles. It starts near Eilat, runs through the Jordan Valley, and continues northward almost to the Syrian border. It's a long, winding line, and in some places it cuts through very remote terrain. At its core, quite literally, is a physical wall, and the plan is for it to be extremely hard to breach. Its height ranges from about 20 to 30 feet. In the most vulnerable areas, it'll consist of solid reinforced concrete designed to withstand heavy impact. A direct hit from heavy machinery? In theory, it's meant to hold. In less sensitive areas, steel sections with dense mesh will be installed, the kind that's not easy to cut through or break. But let's be honest here, 310 miles is not a backyard fence. No one can watch every inch of it at once. In theory, someone could bring in equipment, spend enough time working at it, open a breach, and then start pushing people or goods through. And then there are drones which could bypass a barrier like this with little difficulty, simply because they don't need to stay on the ground. So how do the Israelis plan to deal with that? That's where the idea of a smart barrier comes in. Inside the structure itself, embedded in the steel panels and deeper down in the concrete base, they run fiber optic lines and install vibration sensors. The idea is that the system can tell one type of movement from another. Wind, an animal running past, or an accidental bump is one thing. A sledgehammer, a jackhammer, or someone carefully placing a ladder against the barrier is something else entirely. It can read the difference, almost like human hearing. A rustle is just a rustle, but footsteps behind you are a reason to turn around. Any contact with the barrier triggers an alert almost instantly. One click and the information is already in the nearest operations center. But the wall is only part of the system. Running alongside it is another layer of surveillance, ground radars from the Elm family made by Israel Aerospace Industries. These are built right into the barrier's infrastructure, so they're not standing somewhere off to the side, they're part of the system itself. These systems can see far ahead, several miles into Jordanian territory. They detect vehicle movement, track groups of people, and spot drones long before they get close to the barrier. It's an early warning of sorts. They haven't reached you yet, but you already know they're coming. Alright, Israel may be able to detect that someone is trying to breach the fence, but that alone is obviously not enough to stop illegal smuggling, so what happens next? Let's look at the map. First, there's force deployment. The eastern sector is covered by several divisions, each with its own area of responsibility. On top of that, in 2024, Israel began forming another one, the Reserve 96th Gilad Division. But honestly, that alone doesn't guarantee security, which is why there's a second layer. Instead of relying on traditional patrols driving along the line and simply watching the area, Israel's betting on what are known as mission operations centers. These centers work with mobile rapid response teams, armored vehicles, crews on standby, very little bureaucracy. A sensor goes off and the team moves out. And what about drones? Here, the same radar systems come into play, and the plan is to use anti-drone bases positioned all along the perimeter. They would launch when a threat is detected and intercept drones attempting to carry contraband across the border. All of that sounds serious enough, but the question remains, do Israel's adversaries really have no other way to get past even such an advanced barrier? They do. They can simply go underneath it. If you look back at Israel's experience on its southern front, it was all, frankly, on the verge of engineering madness. Along the Gaza border, militants built an entire underground web, dozens of miles of tunnels reaching deep below the surface. These were not crude holes in the ground, but carefully designed structures with reinforcement, ventilation, and mapped routes. They were built not just for crawling through, but for living in, moving around, and transporting supplies. Some of those tunnels ran directly beneath densely populated neighborhoods or sensitive facilities. Can you imagine that level of sophistication? Above ground, life looked completely normal. Cars, people, children running around, but underneath there was a hidden infrastructure no one knew about, until a certain point. They were used in different ways, but almost always for military advantage. Weapons, ammunition, and personnel were moved through these passages. Some fighters could emerge much closer to Israeli positions. At times, the tunnels also worked as covert reconnaissance corridors, allowing militants to monitor patrol routes, defensive positions, and security patterns, all outside the view of the cameras. So how did Israel plan to fight this on its eastern frontier? the country does have an answer. Underground, along the entire barrier line, they plan to lay a network of fiber optic cables. These operate using DAS technology. In practical terms, every foot becomes a sensitive sensor, like a virtual microphone. It can pick up vibrations, even faint ones. Someone digging, the system can detect it. A drill operating underground, that too. And it can do so even at depths of dozens of feet. They're also installing geophones, sensors that pick up seismic waves moving through the soil. They work like ears pressed to the ground. Anything happening below the surface leaves behind a trace in the form of vibrations. Then the analytics layer takes over. The data is sent in real time to a system with AI-based elements that tries to determine whether it's just background noise or something suspicious. And what do they do in the highest risk areas? Near populated communities, for example, or where the soil is loose and easy to dig through. That's where they build a deep underground barrier, a so-called slurry wall. It's a massive concrete structure extending dozens of feet below ground. It's not just an obstacle, but an almost vertical underground shield. Breaking through something like that is, to put it mildly, extremely difficult. And when you look at all of this, sensors, cables, concrete, radar, mobile response teams, you can't help but wonder, when will it all actually be finished? Well, that's where things become uncertain. There's no clear deadline, the project is huge, the workload is enormous, and as of 2025-2026, the whole system's still being rolled out. There's also one more detail people usually mention only briefly, but it's important. Israel can't simply start building wherever it wants. First, it has to deal with the minefields. There are thousands of mines there. Let me explain. To understand where this whole thing with the minefields came from, you have to go back to 1967. During the Six-Day War, Israel faced a coalition of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. The outcome is well known. Some of those territories came under Israeli control, and parts of that land later became the eastern frontier we're talking about now. At the time, Israel's military leadership was deeply concerned about the possibility of tank breakthroughs from Jordan, fast, deep incursions. There was also the risk of sabotage units using the terrain to their advantage. Lowlands, riverbeds, and all the natural folds in the landscape. You can't realistically station soldiers every 300 feet or so, can you? So they came up with a solution. Create a strip of land that nobody would want to enter in the first place. That was how the so-called uninhabited defensive belt was born. Estimates put it at roughly 300,000 mines. And that got me thinking, maybe that was actually an advantage. Let the mines stay where they are, an extra barrier. Nobody unwanted would try to cross, and you could just build a wall nearby using the old maps as a guide. Sounds almost perfect. But reality, as usual, had other plans. Over the decades, nature did its work. Seasonal floods and shifting soil gradually moved the mines around. They're no longer where they were originally laid. Some sank deeper into silt, while others were carried hundreds of yards away by floodwaters. So the old military maps are no longer reliable. On top of that, the munitions don't last forever. The mines laid in the late 1960s and early 1970s have since been exposed to moisture, extreme heat, and the pressure of the ground for decades. Some are damaged and some behave unpredictably. The irony is that they no longer serve mainly as protection. They now create danger, including for the people trying to build a new protective barrier there. Even careful movement of heavy equipment can trigger an explosion. Not exactly the kind of scenario you want. So yes, the problem is serious. How successful has Israel been in clearing the minefields it no longer needs? The honest answer is progress is being made, but the finish line is still far away. Israel has a dedicated agency that coordinates demining efforts and keeps track of the contaminated areas. Over the past several years, tens of thousands of mines have been neutralized along the Jordan Valley, in the Arava and near Eilat, and in other regions. The numbers are growing, but the scale of the work remains enormous. Recently, as part of preparations for building a new barrier, combat engineers also carried out controlled detonations. About 500 anti-tank mines were destroyed to clear sections of land for construction. But the eastern frontier is still quite literally packed with these things, and that's why construction moves in stages. First, the land is cleared, and only then do the engineers move in. And no, this is definitely not a project that'll be wrapped up by next year. And this is where it gets interesting. Let's go back to the map. Look, all the illegal goods are coming from the east through Jordan. Fine, Israel can reinforce that side. But why don't these illegal shipments come in some other way? Through the north, for example. After all, Israel also borders Lebanon and Syria. The problem is getting through there's pretty much a nightmare-level challenge. The situation with Lebanon is extremely tense right now. Since early March 2026, the two sides have been locked in a serious conflict, and not just a limited flare-up, but a prolonged and brutal confrontation. Rockets, airstrikes, back-and-forth attacks, and ground operations. Large numbers of people are involved, both soldiers and militants. At this point, it looks very much like a full-scale war, without much room for sugarcoating. In this context, Israel has floated the idea of creating a buffer zone reaching all the way to the Litani River. In other words, the goal would be to push deeper into southern Lebanon and eliminate hostile infrastructure entrenched there. That would make for a vast zone stretching along the border. In effect, the border itself is turned into a front line. There are constant rocket attacks, retaliatory strikes, damaged roads, evacuations. In some places, entire towns are left empty. And that raises the question, how does all of this affect smuggling? Quite directly. But no one in their right mind is going to move, say, a dozen pistols and assault rifles through an area packed with troops, military hardware, radar coverage, and the constant risk of being hit. At that point, it's no longer a smuggling corridor, but almost a guaranteed disaster. It's far easier to move through the much calmer eastern sector. And what about Syria? Things are unstable there too. From 2024 to 2026, relations with Israel have essentially hovered on the brink of open conflict, and the border around the Golan Heights, which Israel captured back during the Six-Day War, has become one of the most heavily fortified places in the entire country. It doesn't feel like an ordinary border at all. It's more like a layered defense system, with each part backing up the next. First come the physical barriers, fences, barbed wire, and in some places double fence lines. Between them are cleared, fully visible strips of land so that any movement can be spotted immediately. Then there are patrol roads, allowing vehicles to move quickly along the entire line. The whole area is packed with cameras, motion sensors, and surveillance equipment. On top of that, drones are constantly in the air. As a result, the border sees almost everything. Even small-scale movement is detected before a person or vehicle can get anywhere near the line itself. So if the east were to be sealed off and the north is effectively sealed off already, why do threats not simply come into Israel from the south? After all, that's the border with Egypt, and Jerusalem is not at war with Cairo. There's also plenty of open desert terrain there, but in reality that route's not any easier for moving weapons or anything else. Back in the early 2010s, Israel built a major barrier along its border with Egypt. Metal fencing, cameras, sensors, alarms, the full package. The line runs from Eilat to the Gaza area and was originally designed as a catch-all filter against everything. Illegal crossings, armed groups, and weapons trafficking, but the fence itself is only the visible part of the system. A large section of that border was designated a closed military zone. In late 2025, Defense Minister Israel Katz expanded the powers of the Army and intelligence services in that area. The message was blunt. Any unauthorized attempt to cross, whether on foot or even by drone, should be stopped immediately, without hesitation. Anyone trying to get through without permission is automatically taking a serious risk. It sounds harsh, but the logic is easy to understand. And this is not just something said for the press. Security here has genuinely been tightened. Patrols, equipment at key points, and round-the-clock surveillance. There's a constant sense that the area beyond the line is being watched. But that raises an obvious question. How well does the system actually work in real life? Maybe it looks tough on paper, but doesn't hold up. Judging by recent incidents, though, it seems to be working fairly effectively. For example, in November 2025, the Israeli military intercepted a drone that crossed the border carrying 3 rifles, so the method was already evolving. Instead of crossing on foot through the desert, smugglers tried going by air and bypassing the barrier. It didn't work, though. The drone was tracked and the cargo was seized. There was also a particularly busy day in the summer of 2025. In a single 24-hour period, Israel reportedly thwarted at least 2 infiltration attempts. First, authorities detected a drone carrying 10 firearms. Then they stopped a vehicle with 14 rifles after a short chase. For smugglers, that was a full package, and both attempts failed. The same pattern shows up in drug trafficking cases. From time to time, authorities in the south intercept large shipments, sometimes hundreds of pounds transported by car. What makes the difference is the combination of surveillance and coordination. They spot the movement, track it, and stop it. And this is where another important point comes in, one that's not always stated openly. Egypt in this story is not just a neighboring country on the map, it's also part of the broader containment effort and essentially helps restrict flows that could otherwise move through the south. In recent years, Egypt has tightened control significantly on the Sinai Peninsula. Patrol activity has increased and enforcement has become much more noticeable. And this is not only about the border itself, it's part of a broader internal campaign against radical groups, underground networks, and smugglers. In northern Sinai, operations take place regularly. Hideouts are uncovered, weapons caches are dismantled, and arms are confiscated. Sometimes it looks less like a single campaign and more like a long-running cleanup operation that simply moves from one phase to the next. There's also the tunnel issue. These are the same tunnels that drew so much attention in past years when they were used to move everything from everyday goods to ammunition. Egypt has dealt with them quite systematically. Some were flooded, others were demolished outright. It's an ongoing effort. One route shut down, another appears, and the cycle repeats. Still, overall, the number of functioning tunnels seems to have dropped noticeably. Why do Israel and Egypt not operate openly and in sync like a single team? Well, their relationship has never exactly been simple, to put it mildly. Even so, in practice, there is coordination. It may not be public, but it is there. From time to time, Israeli military officials and government representatives make it clear that any attempt to cross the border, on foot, by vehicle, or by drone, is monitored closely. And Egypt plays a role in that process. Sometimes a threat is intercepted before it even gets close to the border. Other times, it's stopped on approach. Either way, there's coordination. So the broader picture looks like this. The north is consumed by conflict, the south is under tight control and smugglers don't have much room to operate there. That leaves the direction that appears relatively more accessible, the east. And that's exactly why Israel is investing so heavily in fortifying that line. Will it work perfectly? That remains to be seen. But judging by the scale of what's being built there, the Israelis clearly intend to seal off what they see as a vulnerable spot as tightly as possible.